Well, hello everybody, and welcome to our class today on fixing sticky problems in Family Tree. So glad that you could join us. If this is your first time attending one of these classes, I just wanted to give a little context. This is one of two classes that are supplemental for the intermediate series that we just completed. So last week we had class one, recognizing problems in family tree and determining causes. And today we're actually going to talk about fixing those sticky problems that we found. If you missed any of the previous classes, the recordings are available on the BYU Library Family History Center website, and the missionaries will put the link to that in the chat. This class is intended for a certain audience. One potential audience is people who are trying to clean up sticky problems on their own lines, and the other is if you help people to clean up sticky problems. So hopefully this class will be helpful in both of those situations. We'd like to invite you to watch for key takeaways from class today. For those of you, again, who might be new, we do this all the time, asking people to share key takeaways. And key takeaways are just something that strikes you during the class, some bit of inspiration, or something that you think you'll be able to use in your family history. And it doesn't have to be something that was actually said in class. That's the interesting thing. Sometimes you'll get inspiration about something, or an idea from class will spark a different idea. What we find though is that when you share those ideas with your fellow participants, everybody is uplifted. So we just invite you to watch for those things that you might like to share at the end, and then we'll invite you to do so in the chat. So here's what we've got on the schedule for today. First of all, we're going to do a very quick review of last week's class, just in case you missed it, or I think a review is good no matter what. Last week was a long time ago. In fact, sometimes I switch screens on my computer, like, and a minute later, I've forgotten what I was doing before. So a review is good. Then we're going to present a very simple fixing process. Basically, it's three principles to follow. Then we're going to apply those principles in our continued case study that we started last week. And finally, we'll wrap up with some success tips for fixing those sticky problems. So let's review very quickly last week's class. For purposes of this class and last week's, of course, I wanted to be very clear what kinds of problems we're talking about. We're not talking about fairly, I don't want to say trivial, but things that are simple and easy to correct. We're not talking about those types of problems, such as a date being off by just a little bit, a spelling variation, or a non-standard date or place name. In the overall scheme of things, while we do want our records to be as accurate as possible, these little things are kind of like drops on our family tree. Yeah, we want to clean them up, but it's not a huge deal. It doesn't really affect temple work. It doesn't cause problems for other users. The kinds of problems that we're talking about tackling in our class today are impossible or conflicting dates and places, such as a child being born before her parents, incorrect relationships, such as somebody being connected to the wrong parent or the wrong spouse, and especially bad merges, because once a bad merge is done, it very often uh, spreads across families and generations, and bad merges are the cause of most problems in family tree. And if we're comparing, if these little problems over here are like a drop of water on a tree, these types of problems are kind of like the rushing stream that can kind of knock branches off and sometimes even make trees fall into the stream. So these are the kinds of problems that we're going to talk about resolving today. We also talked last week about a very important principle when you're trying to solve problems. So let me state it this way. When you create a private tree, like suppose you have your private tree on Ancestry or you keep it in Family Tree Maker or something like that, When you create a profile for a person, you know which human being that is supposed to represent. Maybe it's your grandparent, maybe it's an aunt or uncle, but you know which human being it is. In a shared tree, we know which human being the profiles we create are supposed to represent, but we don't necessarily know who the profiles are supposed to represent when they're created by other people. But the thing is, every time somebody creates a profile, they virtually always know what human being it's supposed to represent. So we're going to use a term for that. We're going to call that intended identity. And the reason that that's important is that in a shared tree, when people come along and with the best of intentions might do a bad merge or put a wrong birth date in or whatever, the intended identity, that original purpose of the profile, can get lost or changed. The earliest changelog entries will show the original intended identity. In other words, which human being this profile was meant to represent. And here's the point. The original identity becomes the baseline for untangling problems because otherwise you're building on shifting sand. There's no way to have a firm foundation for untangling a problem. So we always want to go back to that original identity that whoever created the profile, we want to go back to who they intended that profile to represent. Another tip that we reviewed last week that is very, very important is to diagnose the problem correctly. If you try to fix the wrong problem, chances are that the real one will get worse. And let's just look at a really simple example. So here's our poster buddy, Samuel Hibbert. He's kind of the poster child for a mangled family. I've actually been trying to clean him up and it's taken a long time. And somebody came in and kind of messed him up again and undid the stuff that I had done. And so this poor guy is just a mess. He has at least 13 merges on him representing at least 5 different families. Well, this guy has a death date of the 3rd of November, 1855. Notice that he's got some errors on him, some data errors saying that his kids were born after he died. Well, a well-meaning user came along and concluded, just assumed, I'm guessing she probably didn't even think about it too deeply. She just assumed that these kids were right and then said, oh dear, if those kids are right, then he couldn't have died before the kids. And so she removed the death date. Well, of course, when she removed the death date, these errors went away. But if we look in the change log and we look for those 13 merges, we find that the children that those errors were on were added through a series of bad merges and they weren't his kids. So the solution was not to remove the death date to make the data errors go away, but it was actually to get the kids out of this family and into the right family where they belonged. And that was the right way to get the error to go away, or errors. Okay, with that as a background and review for last week, let's introduce the very simple fixing process. When I say simple, it's simple in that it's only 3 steps, but actually applying it takes a lot of thought and effort and inspiration. So let's look at the 3 steps. After you correctly diagnose the problem, then here is the fixing problem. And the order is important. I found by trial and error over the years that if I don't do it in this order, I tend to tangle things up worse while I'm trying to fix them. So the first thing you want to do when there's a mess is look for any incorrect merges. And if there are any, then go ahead and untangle them first. Undo those incorrect merges first. After you've undone the incorrect merges, the next step is to fix the relationships. That can't be done accurately until the merges are repaired. And then the last step is to fix the incorrect information, such as birth, death, and so forth. and sources, and this is always done relative to that intended identity. So once you've untangled everybody, then you say, who was this person intended to be? And then you look at all the information, and if it's about that person, about the original intended identity, you leave it there. But if it's not, like if it's a source for a person in another family, or the birth date doesn't match that original intended identity, then you remove that information. And if possible, put it onto the right person. Okay, so that's a pretty simple process as far as the number of steps, right? But let's walk through it now as we apply it to our case study. So last time we met the Parkinson family, and they've got a little problem in their family, in family tree, in that they've got three boys named William. Now, a lot of you are probably aware that in a number of countries, especially prior to the 1900s, if a child died, it was not uncommon for the parents to give a subsequent child the same name. The trouble was, in this case, each of the two older Williams lived past the date that the next William was born. So that indicates that they weren't naming kids the same name because the older one died, because they were still alive. So we decided we wouldn't tackle all three Williams last time. We would just tackle William number one and determine whether he really belongs in this family or whether he belongs someplace else. If he really belongs in this family, then we would need to look at the other two Williams and decide if they really belonged in this family. Well, as we went through the research, to make a long story short, last week, we found that at least two families had been mixed up. Part of the problem was that both of them had a dad named Thomas Parkinson, and the mom was Elizabeth or Betty because Betty's a nickname for Elizabeth. So somebody saw the parents and just assumed, oh, they must all be the same family. But we were able to find them in the census records. We found that one always lived in Bolton and the other family always lived in Whalley. And it was really clear that there were two different families, even though the parents had the same name. Well, as we looked in Family Tree, these gray arrows indicate the people who really do belong to this couple, to Thomas and Elizabeth. But as we researched William more carefully, we found out he didn't belong in this family. He belongs with the Whalley family. So now that we've made that determination, and again, the analysis was done last week, so we're just summarizing it very briefly. But to hear the analysis, go ahead and watch the recording if you weren't able to watch it last week, or if you want a refresher on it, because it's a pretty when we say sticky problems, that's not an exaggeration. These are pretty complicated problems. So, but we now know that William is in the wrong family and we've got to get him into the right one. How do we do that? Well, the first thing is, remember when we said that we want to know what caused the error so we know how to fix it. When we went into the change log, we discovered that the problem was, and we alluded to this just a minute ago, that the two sets of parents with the same name had been merged, but they weren't the same people. So William's original parents in the change log are these people right here, Thomas that ends in HCB and Betty that ends in HZX. But they were merged in with this Thomas ending in FHL. That's a great acronym, right, for family history, like Family History Library. And this Elizabeth ending in YSK. So the solution here has to be to undo those bad merges. If we tried anything else on that, chances are it would just make the problem worse. So let's walk through step one. So the first thing I wanted to do, even though I know there were bad merges on the parents, I also wanted to see if there were any bad merges on William the son. Fortunately, there weren't. So this screen shows that when I filtered to merges, it says no changes exist for the selected filter, the merge filter. And for those of you who may not be familiar with this, all I did to filter to merges is I clicked filter and then I selected merges. And then in the changelog, it only showed merges. If there's nothing that matches your filter, it says, nope, there's no changes that match the filter that you requested. So fortunately, there were no bad merges on William, which was great news. But we know there's bad merges on the parents. So how do we go about fixing them? Well, the change log for William shows his original parents that were deleted in the bad merges. So what we want to do is go to those parents and restore them. And it's pretty simple in the change log. You just click the name of the parent that you want to restore and you get their summary card. And you notice it says that the person was deleted. So then you can either click the name or actually you can also click person. They do exactly the same thing. So when we do that, we get back to a screen. And I do need to mention that this is the older UI, but the functions are still the same. So now when you go in, this is going to look slightly different, but there still will be, and sorry, I just realized UI, that's like an acronym that might not be familiar to everybody. That stands for user interface. And earlier this year, FamilySearch kind of gave the person page a facelift. And so the functions, like a lot of the functions stayed the same, but they just gave it like a cleaner, more modern look. So you'll see, again, this is the old user interface. So when you try to restore someone, it will look slightly different, very nice, but this option will still be there. It'll still say restore person. So we click on restore person and it pops up a screen, which is very good for us to kind of do some sanity checking. It lets us see if when the person merged, did they provide a reason statement? Well, here is my favorite reason statement that I hate. She probably, maybe that's too strong, but I would love it if FamilySearch would just do away with this reason statement because it's one of those canned ones on the end of the merge. And almost every time I've seen this used, it has meant that the merge was wrong. So it says, well, almost everything matches, but there were some conflicts. Well, usually the conflicts mean that they weren't the same person, and that was the case here. These two Thomases were not the same. So I just explained here why I was undoing the merge, why I was restoring the person. And notice that this doesn't have to be long or complicated. I just kind of hit the high points. This Thomas was born this year, and he was from Whalley, so probably that's where he was born. That's where he lived. The other Thomas was born this year, lived in this place, and I found the two men and their families separately in the census, so there's no way they're the same person. And so after you put in a clear reason statement that helps people understand your thinking, then you go ahead and click restore and the person comes back. Then we have to do the same thing with Betty. We're not going to walk through the steps for her because they're identical. But look what happened after the merge repair. This is why repairing relationships has to be the second step. So after the merges are fixed. So here's cute William. And instead of being joined to just the wrong parents, he now has three sets of parents. He has the wrong ones, he has the right ones, and he has a weird case with the right dad and the wrong mom. So we need to fix all of those issues. So we're to step 2. When you go to fix issues on between children and parents, the child has to be visible under the parents because we need to click this pencil icon to do the editing. And again, this icon got a facelift. It's a little bit different, but it's still a pencil on the new screen. Notice that pencil is not over here for William. So sometimes people get in and they don't see any kids under the parents. Well, the reason that happens is you can actually collapse the kids by clicking this item right here, this button. So if you get into a couple and you see that the kids aren't showing, just click the button here and it will drop down the children, unless it says 0, and then there's no children to drop down. But if it's 1 or greater and the kids aren't showing, then click this button and it will display the children. Then we click the pencil icon next to the child, and it brings us up a screen where we can fix relationships. So I wanted to point out here why I am choosing the remove or replace next to William. And I've always felt that this was a little bit counterintuitive. So maybe you guys will get it immediately. I didn't. I struggled with this for a while. But you notice there's a remove or replace link next to the dad. There's another one next to the mom, and there's one next to William. If you click the one by the dad, it will only remove the dad. So you would do that in the case where one parent was right and the other parent was wrong. You'd remove the wrong one, but keep the right one. Same thing by the mom. If you just want to remove her, you'd click this link. But if you want to remove both parents at the same time, you click the link next to the kid. I did not think that was obvious at all, so I wanted to point that out for all of us who are trying to undo these sticky problems. So because both of those parents were wrong, I'm going to click this link and it brings me up a screen and it shows what relationship I'm going to break by that red X. And then it explains my options. I can either remove the parents entirely, or if I needed to replace them for some reason, suppose that I knew they were wrong, but the right ones weren't connected at all, and I knew where they were, then I could choose to replace those wrong parents with the right ones. But in this case, we just want to remove the wrong ones. Notice the little checkbox here that says, I have reviewed the relationship sources and notes. If you don't check that, these buttons will be grayed out and you won't be able to proceed any further. So this is a good sanity check to say, hey, did I look at this all really carefully to make sure that I'm doing the right thing? Well, last week we spent about an hour looking at it pretty carefully, so we're confident that we've done our due diligence and that we know the right thing to do. So we're going to click Remove Parents and then write a clear reason statement. Now, I've got to admit on this one, on bad merges, it could take like 5 paragraphs to explain why the bad merges happened and, you know, like all the problems and so forth. So usually when I'm disconnecting wrong parents or disconnecting a wrong spouse that was added through a bad merge, I just say it's due to a bad merge and I leave it at that. I don't know if anyone else would explain it more thoroughly. That would be great if they did, but I figure this is a simple explanation and it does the trick. Anybody who comes along would say, "Oh, okay, I get it. That there was a bad merge. Somebody was repairing the bad merge." So after I write the reason statement, then I click remove. And notice one set of incorrect parents is gone. And then we want to do the same thing for the one with the right dad and the wrong mom. And on that one, you still, interestingly enough, to the best of my memory, if we were to just disconnect the wrong mother here, it would remove her, but it would leave William under this couple and it would leave him under this guy, but these guys are the same. HCB, HCB. So even though in this case there was a right wrong, we want to break both those relationships, if that makes sense. So we still want to click the link next to William that will remove both these relationships. So when we do that, voila, we've only got the right parents connected to William. So this is looking really good. The relationships are fixed. Well, but are they? So anytime there's been a bad merge on the parents of somebody, it's always a good idea to go to the parents pages and see if there are any problems. So I popped over to Thomas's page and saw that he's still connected to the other Thomas's wife, which I'm sure that neither of those Thomases were very happy about on the other side. So we need to break that connection. So again, this is the same pencil thing. You just click the pencil icon. You're going to get a screen very similar to the screen breaking the relationships that are wrong between a parent and child. And you just say, break the relationship, explain why, and you disconnect them, and the problem is fixed. Then I looked at Betty's page, and fortunately, she didn't have any wrong relationships either, so we were all good there and ready to move on to the final step. And that is to look at everybody that was involved in the bad merges, so that'd be William and his parents, and fix the any incorrect dates or sources or locations or whatever doesn't match the original intended identity. We want to get rid of that and just leave what is good. And if there are any sources that need to be added, adding good sources can help prevent bad merges in the future. So we want to be sure to add any good sources that will help. So let's take a look at cute William first. Yeah, don't you find sometimes when you work on these families, you just grow to love them? And so we come to William's page and we notice that he's got the correct birth date because we saw that last week in the christening record. It gave his birth date. But you might remember from last week that somebody added this wrong birthplace based on thinking this guy was in the Bolton family, but he wasn't. He was in the Whalley family. And of course, the christening information is correct. We know that from the christening record that we looked at last week. So we click the edit button, the little pencil next to this, sorry, again, old screenshot. Now the word edit does not appear. It's a pencil. So you click the pencil and you get a screen that looks very much like this. Here is a trick that I learned from somebody at FamilySearch, which is really cool, and it's not immediately obvious. If you've got something like a date or a place that is not standard, you can actually click in the non-standard place. And what I've noticed is sometimes standard options will come up, but if they don't, you can hit a space bar and your space bar on the keyboard, and it will make the standard options come up. And then you just click whichever standard option you want. So here, the only reason this is non-standard is that this is capitalized and it's an abbreviation. So, and it even shows the standard here. It shows what was the original and what FamilySearch standardized it to. And then this, of course, we don't care whether this is standard because it's wrong. We've got to change this to the right birthplace. So notice one thing here. This is a little, not a huge deal, but in case you're interested about this, when FamilySearch does its best to automatically standardize something, it will leave the original and it will add its standard. But then you have two things, and to me that kind of clutters the screen. So if you click in here and the top one and select the standard, which is what I did here, notice that it makes the double entry go away. And then you've just got one standard and it's the right one. And then for the birthplace, I put in Haslingden. We actually never, you may remember, we never found a census that had William's birthplace on it, but we found the census for the other kids. They were all born in Haslingden, and the christening said that the family lived in Haslingden. So I felt really confident that he was born in Haslingden too. But notice down here when I explained it, I put where each piece of information came from. So I said the birth date came from the christening record, and the birthplace was inferred from the christening record and the birthplace of the other children. So that just gives people a little heads up when they read it that this is like my very best guess, even though I didn't at the time have a source that absolutely said that he was born in Haslingden. And it is okay to make strong inferences because sometimes we don't find the information, a source that exactly says that, but we have really strong reasons to believe it. There's a difference between making a justified inference and jumping to a conclusion without any evidence at all. So we want to make inferences only if we're really, really certain, like we're about, maybe 95 to 99% certain that that information is correct. And so this is what William looks like when the dates have been standardized and the places have been corrected. Now we want to look at his sources. And I found that it's worthwhile to go through all the sources and detach any that aren't right. And you might be going, well, what is the big deal about that? Why should I take time to do that? In a shared tree, there's a really, really important reason, and that is that Family Tree is a very clever program. The application developers have just done an amazing job of having Family Tree help us. The way it suggests, you remember on the person page, on the profile page, over to the right-hand side, there will often be record hints. And those record hints are records in Family Search historical records that Family Search thinks they're probably about this person. The thing is, it uses sources that are already attached to find more sources. So Family Search rightfully assumes that these sources are correct. If we leave wrong sources on here, Family Search will keep dishing up wrong record hints over on the person page. And then chances are that people will come and attach them and then do bad merges, and all of our cleanup efforts will be reversed, and we don't want that. So we'll start with the first source at the top. We click to open that, and this is what we see. Well, everything matches what we already know about this guy. The birth date is correct. It matches his original intended identity. The dad is right. The mom is right. The christening date is right. The christening location is right. So this source stays. This is a good one. And if Family Search dishes up more hints that match this, they're going to be good hints. But let's take a look at the next one. Do you see what happened down here? I don't know if you remember, but Thomas, Richard, William, and Eliza, these are all the kids from the Bolton family that were in Family Tree, and this Betty is Betty Hoyles. So it even says Bolton as the residence. So this source is clearly for that other family. It's not for this one. Fortunately, it's super easy to detach wrong sources. You just click to open up the source, and when you do that, you get this little drop down, and one of the options is detach. So you click detach, and it asks you to explain why you're detaching. And notice here when the person, this just makes me smile. The poor person who attached this incorrect source probably was puzzled by the thought of doing a reason statement. They're like, "Oh, whatever. I mean, it's for Thomas and Betty, so it's got to be right." So they just put as the reason this source was attached. Yep. Well, turns out it wasn't the right source. So here we do a little reason statement to explain why this source does not apply to this William. And we click detach, and it removes the source. Then we want, oh, and by the way, the other one, let me pop back really quickly. We're not going to walk through it, but this census is also wrong. So we detach both those wrong censuses, and then we want to find the right one. So I click the Family Search logo because that will run a search in Family Search historical records using the information on the page. I love these searches here. They save so much time. You don't even have to like type in all the stuff. It just grabs the information for you and puts it in the search form. So I bring up the search results and I know I'm looking for the family from Wally, and lo and behold, there they are. They come up third result down, pretty good. But notice this little icon. This means that the source is already attached to somebody. Well, it wasn't attached to our William, so who is it attached to? Uh-oh. It's attached to a different William with a completely different PID. And this is a time where I should note, when you do family history, and you guys are probably all aware of this, you've probably all experienced it, that as you're trying to solve one problem or add one person or whatever, because of the tree-like structure of families and family history information, there will always be little random branches that you'll find, tasks that you need to do. So here, this task now is we got to figure out what on earth is going on with this William Parkinson. But I don't want to interrupt my review of the sources and my repair of our William by going down this rabbit hole right now. So I'm just going to make a note of it so that I remember to come back to it later. Now that I've cleaned up William, I need to go in and do the same thing to his parents. So I expand Thomas's name because that THOS was just an abbreviation from a christening record. There's nothing sacred about it except the poor guy just wrote in a, if you're the clergyman who's writing 100 christening entries, then probably you are going to abbreviate some stuff. So, but for his temple work, we want his name to be complete. So we just expand that to Thomas. And I added the birth information from the census. That birth information was not there before. And then we go to Betty's and we do the same thing, except her situation is a little more complicated. So on English christening records, as is the case in many countries, so this could apply to other countries besides England, the mother's maiden surname is not given. But in Family Tree and in all genealogy sites that I'm aware of, the best practice is to use the mother's maiden surname because it's unambiguous. If we use one of her married names, what if she was married 3 or 4 times? Or what if there's a woman with an unmarried surname that is the same as another woman's married surname? So you can see that going by anything but the maiden surname could cause all kinds of issues and does in Family Tree actually. So if you don't know the maiden surname, it's better to leave it blank, as was done here with this record for Betty. But there's a lot of information about this family in historical records, so probably it's not going to be too hard to find her maiden surname. Let's take a look at how we could do that. We're going to use the wonderful principle of using what we know to discover what we don't know. The reason that's a wonderful principle is that it builds a solid foundation. We're not just going to jump to a conclusion based on maybe somebody having a same name, and that's all, but we're going to use what we know to build that solid bridge to find the information that we don't know. So last week we made a timeline grid. And just to walk over, I know when you come cold into a timeline grid, it doesn't necessarily make sense. So I'll explain it briefly. In this first column, we've just kind of got a summary of the people in the family. We've got dad with his birth date, mom with her birth date, birth year. We don't know her last name at this point, and we've got all the kids with their births from the christening records, and they match the census. Then we've got the 1841 census for this family and the information for each one of them. And then the same thing in the 1851 census. By now, Thomas has died, sad for Betty, but she was able to remarry. So here she is with a new married name, case in point, right? Her name changed. And then these kids have all left home, understandably, because they'd be 10 years older by then. But these kids are still with the family. So, what we want to do to find Betty's maiden surname is probably look for a marriage. That's probably the best source at this point because this is before English civil registration. And for those of you familiar with English civil registration, you might have been thinking, well, you can get the mother's surname, maiden surname, on civil registration, but it didn't start until 1837. So we're not going to find it on William because he was born before that. In fact, all of these kids before John were born before that, and John was born right on the border. So we actually don't even know if he really made it into civil registration. So probably the best bet is to look for a marriage. But when and where? Well, this is where we're going to use what we know to discover what we don't know. From the ages of Thomas and Betty, we can kind of deduce when their marriage might have taken place. They probably didn't get married before age 18. So that would be about 1814 because they're born about the same time, 96, 97. Women usually got married a little younger than men as a general rule in the older days, I should say, like in the 1800s and earlier. We also know something really important from this first child that's listed here. The couple would have been married by sometime in 1822 or about 1822 because that's when their son Henry was born. So basically, we're looking for a marriage of a Thomas Parkinson and any Betty or Elizabeth between 1814 and 1822. And we probably, as we see that Betty was born in Haslingden, that's her birthplace there, at this time in England, women were usually married in their home parish. So there's a good chance that the couple got married in Haslingden. So we're going to do a search. We're going to search for Thomas Parkinson, married in Haslingden between these years that we talked about, and the mom is Betty. Just for context, this is the search form for Family Search historical records. So I fill this all out and then I run the search. Oh my goodness. So Thomas Parkinson and Betty, that's not an uncommon name, apparently, because within our very narrow parameters, we came up with two possibilities. Both of them are reasonable. And just to save us a little time, I'll tell you that I actually looked on the images and there was nothing on these images as far as occupation or parents or residents or anything that would tell these two people apart. The only thing we know is that one Betty is Betty Ashworth and the other Betty is Betty Barnes. And we have no way of knowing which one of these gals is our gal that we're looking for, the mother of William. So we've got a really cool clue here, and that is that Betty remarried. Why this is a cool clue is that those early marriage records back in the 1820s in England often didn't list the occupation or the parents or anything that would help us identify that person. But since Betty was married to Thomas in 41, and then he died, and she was married to Henry by 51, the record of her marriage to Henry Barlow is going to be the later version that often did list the mother's maiden name and the parents, or excuse me, not mother's maiden name, but it would help us know her maiden name because it would list her father. So there is the marriage record. It was, I searched for a marriage of a Betty Parkinson because she would have gotten married under her last married name to Henry Barlow. That was his name in the census. We knew it happened between 41 and 51 and everything matched up. I felt very comfortable that this was right. They got married in Haslingden. She is a widow. And look at who her dad is, Henry Barnes. So now we're confident that the marriage for the Thomas Parkinson to Barnes is the right marriage, and Barnes is her maiden name. So we come back here and we correct Betty's name to be Betty Barnes, and the corrected record is done. But this goes back now to our comment about rabbit holes. When you correct information in Family Tree, often other tasks or problems will come up. And here we've got a really good example of, remember, we know that Betty Ashworth she's most likely a different Betty. So there is a slight chance. Well, no. Okay, I guess before we found out that Betty Barnes's dad was Henry Barnes, before we absolutely knew that her maiden name was Barnes, there was a slight possibility that Betty Ashworth and Betty Barnes could be the same if she was widowed very young and remarried. But now we know they're not the same. Why this is showing up here, I'm not exactly positive because I would think that if we know the name is Barnes, that this hint would not show up here. But anyway, it does. And so we've got two tasks here where we need to resolve these duplicates. that is another thing we're just going to make a note of. We're actually not going to do that today. The reason I pointed it out is, again, you're often going to find extra tasks as you're doing one task, and you don't want to get sidetracked, but you want to make a note of them and at least take care of them later. Remember that time when I mentioned that, I remember a few slides back, where the 1841 census was connected to the wrong guy? So I thought I had another slide here, but I don't. So I apologize. This was kind of a jump. So going back to that wrong William, let's see where, yeah, his siblings have been connected to this Betty Ashworth. Okay, I wonder if I accidentally deleted a slide or something, and I apologize for that because this is a, a jump that seems to be missing some steps. But you remember there was a Jenny in that christening record. There was actually, Nanny is a mistranscription. It's really Nancy. And there was a Jane and there was a John. And so some of these kids have been connected to the wrong couple. So that's another thing that has to be fixed. So, do you guys remember the Greek myth about Hydra? Hydra was a monster that if you chopped off one of her heads, she grew two heads in place of the one that you chopped off. Sometimes when you're doing family history and you solve one problem and two other problems pop up or five other problems pop up, you might feel like you are fighting Hydra. The solution is to write things down. If you go down rabbit holes, you'll make yourself crazy. At least I do when I ignore that good advice and try to go down the rabbit hole, then I forget what I was doing. I lose my context. So generally speaking, it really is better to stick with one task until it's done, but write down the tasks that you come across that you know that you need to do later. This slide right here is actually from another presentation that I need to give you a link to. I'm not sure if I put that in the deck actually. So let me just walk through really quickly. The purpose of this slide is to show you that there are a lot of options for writing things down. Sometimes people get really frustrated about writing things down, especially if, like, they took a genealogy class and somebody said, you have to keep a research log and you have to do it this way. And they try to do it and it's tedious and it takes so much time and it's so frustrating. And so people go, forget it. I'm not going to write anything down. I just had a really bad experience with this. Well, there are a lot of solutions for writing things down, from very simple to very complex. You can jot things down in a paper notebook. You can throw them into an electronic document like a Google document or a WordPerfect document. You can use a traditional research log. There are a lot of varieties available on the internet if you just search. I have friends who love spreadsheets for tracking their tasks. You can use Evernote. I have a friend who loves that. You can use Trello, which is kind of an electronic task card system. You can Google Trello to learn more about that. We've talked about the timeline grid, which is a table where you just capture information on your family. One of my very favorites that I use all the time is Goldie May. Goldie May, that's the only one I'm going to go into a little more detail on today, just because I think this is such a cool program. So there is a free version that provides really adequate functions, but if you want to get the paid version, it's really not that expensive and it has even more robust features. The thing I love about Goldie May is that it's actually designed to be used with family history. So a spreadsheet, it's designed to just be a table and used for many, many purposes. So you kind of have to do a lot of customization to make it work for your family history purposes. But Goldie May is designed with family history in mind. It integrates with FamilySearch. For instance, you can pop in a PID and it will create a link to that person in FamilySearch. You just have to put the PID in and it does it for you. It's awesome. One of the features on the paid version, as I recall, I don't think this is on the free version. Somebody correct me if you use Goldie May and if I'm wrong about that. But the subway map is actually a plotting of the sources attached to a person in Family Tree so that you can see if there's something really weird. Like if the sources jump from, say, England to America to England to America to England to America, which I actually saw one time. Somebody had merged two families in the 1700s, and half the kids were born in Virginia and half the kids were born in England. Well, there was no way that that family kept hopping across the Atlantic Ocean, right, to have their kids in. So the subway map will let you see those kinds of problems. Or if there's like one source in, say, Lancashire and everything else is in Yorkshire, well, that could be right, but that could also be a red flag. So at least it shows you, check this out, just make sure it's right. So if you decide that you'd like to use a program like this, I'm just mentioning this. It's not a paid endorsement or anything, just because I found this so useful. So go to goldiemay.com if you would like more information.
Sister Grant,
Yes.
the subway map is only in the premium version, but you can access the premium version from any Family Search Center or in our Family History Center at the BYU Library.
Oh, perfect. Sister Esplin, thank you so much for supplying that information. Super. So there you have it, folks. That's the answer to that question. Okay, let's wrap up today by just reviewing some quick tips for being successful at untangling these merges. The biggest one I found, well, maybe I better not say biggest one, but definitely an important one, is to prioritize. You can't do or fix everything, and that's okay. I like to share the example of my friend Julie. Some of you might remember this. She's an amazing woman. She has, I think, 10 kids at this time. She was getting a master's degree and is one of the most serving, loving people you could ever meet. So she's always like her schedule is filled with ministering and doing kind things for people. And she also does family history. Well, one time we were working together on a mess, and it provoked another, like we've discovered another mess. And I just said to her, there's this other one that at some point needs to be cleaned up, but what is your feeling about that? Do you want to do it, write it down for later, or just let it go? And she actually took some time to pray about it. And she said the answer she got was no, that's not your priority to work on. You've got other things that you need to do. So when we're working in the Lord's vineyard, I think one of the keys to success is to follow the guidance of the Spirit. Because since we can't do everything, then what better way to decide what to do than seek the Lord's guidance? And then He can let us know what things are the most important things to focus on. The next tip is to be methodical. Definitely follow a process like the 3-step process that we went over today. I just know from experience that if you try to fix the dates or try to fix the relationships before fixing the merges, it will just cause problems. So following that process is really valuable. And then again, writing things down is really valuable. If you have multiple merges, including merges within merges, then a comparison table may help. So here's this example right here, but if you want to see the actual document, you can click here, and then this link will take you to a page with templates. And I'm going to do a risk here because I found that whenever I click links, the sound tends to go bad. Oh my goodness, at that time I did not get an error message. That's amazing. So here is the page with other templates. Right now, it just has one category, which is merge analysis templates. You've either got your choice of a Google Doc template, which is like that blue one we just looked at, or I've recently started using Google Sheets instead because often there's so many bad merges. Like I'm working on one right now that has about 26 people combined, and I found that the spreadsheet works much better for that. So if those templates are helpful to you, just please feel free to download them and use them. So, but being methodical is a great way not to make yourself crazy and also to make sure that you do take care of everything that needs to be taken care of when you're untangling these messes. The next tip is to be part of the solution instead of part of the problem. What I found is so often, like there are a lot of messes in Family Tree, as probably all of you have seen. But the thing is, Very few people intend to make messes. I've only heard of a couple of people who were actually malicious. They had like an axe to grind with the church, so they got in and said, "Yeah, I'm really going to screw things up." But that is so much the exception and not the rule. Most people who get in and make problems in Family Tree never intended to. They thought they were doing the right thing. So we can be part of the solution instead of creating problems in Family Tree by following these principles, I guess here are these suggestions. Don't assume. Try to find the best evidence you can, but don't just jump to conclusions. Use what you know to discover what you don't know. Don't do a merge unless you're really sure that it's right. Again, most of the problems in Family Tree, in my experience, come from bad merges. And then also do your best to add accurate information to Family Tree. Attach those sources. Take the time to enter the birth date and the death date. The more we add accurate information, the more we're going to help everybody else who works in Family Tree. And here's a bonus tip. When I first started doing this, I just sometimes my head would spin when I would start untangling these terrible messes with like 20 people merged into them. But what I found over time is that it really did get easier. It's just like exercising. As you exercise, you build body strength, you build mental strength. It's the same thing with untangling these messes. Building those skills definitely will make it easier for you as you go on, and you'll be able to just make a greater and greater contribution to Family Tree. So this brings us to the end of our class today. Just by way of summary, we did a quick review of last week's class. We talked about the three-step fixing process. We walked through the case study and we shared some success tips for fixing sticky problems. Elder Coles or Sister Esplin, were there any questions that need to be addressed?
There was one in the Q&A. Where do you stop or start fixing things, extra tasks, once your own family is fixed?
Oh, Gordon, that is such a good question. For me, at least, this goes back to following the spirit. So really, I do, because I do work with a lot of people as a person who has a stake calling as a consultant, and Gordon is the ward Temple and Family History leader in his ward in Canada. Gordon, unless you've been released, but I'm guessing that you still are and that you're still helping a lot of people. So that's a very valid question. Where do you draw the line? And I would say follow the promptings of the Spirit. And the other time that I do work on families that aren't my own is when there's been a bad merge and I'm afraid that it's going to get messed up again. So I will go to that family, like suppose that it was just one person or it was just one person and their spouse, but no kids. And that's why they got mixed up with another couple with the same name or whatever. Then I will go build out that family, like put in their kids, put in their parents, attach the sources to the point where I feel that they're sufficiently built out that somebody won't confuse the two families again. Just to summarize, Gordon, the answer to that question, one is preventative. I would say do what you feel is necessary or to do everything possible so that people are not likely to make mistakes in the future. And the other is follow the spirit.